Welcome back. The topic for today's discussion would be consciousness and Indian model. This is Shivendra Vikram Singh. And in the next 1 hour, I will be discussing my model, my Indian model, which concerns that how particularly we form phenomenal consciousness. So we shall begin with the question: is consciousness a monolith? The answer is yet there is no single definition. There is wide applicability of the word consciousness itself. In the sense that consciousness is heterogeneous in its nature, it can be applied to whole organisms or to specific mental states or to functional properties or to some experiential qualities that is we call qualia. Now, in philosophy, there are four main uses of the word conscious. The first main use of the word conscious is when it comes to creature consciousness. Second is the transitive consciousness, state consciousness, and fourth it is the phenomenal consciousness. We will be discussing this as we go forward in the lecture. Creature consciousness is when a person is sentient, when he responds to the world, when he is capable of sensing the world. Then you have wakefulness. Then you have self-consciousness that you need to be aware about yourself. And the last criterion of creature consciousness is the Nagel's criterion that what it feels like to be in a particular state of subjective experience from one's own point of view. Then there is the transitive consciousness. Transitive consciousness is the relation between the creature and something it is conscious of. You may be conscious of the lecture slides in front of you. You may be conscious about my voice. So it is a relation between the creature and what you're conscious of. The object of consciousness and the creature that is consciousness is different, and it is the relation between them. State consciousness applies to particular states of consciousness. For example, you may contrast unconscious states with conscious states. You can contrast subliminal perception with other forms of perception. So this is the basic formulation of state consciousness. Then the third is the fourth is the phenomenal consciousness. It is the particularly what it is like of experience, or as Nagel would call, what it is like to be a particular organism, or what it is like to be in a particular state. For example, seeing red. Nagel famously gave the example of a bat. Bat uses echolocation or sonar systems for echolocation, and in that sense, no human can understand what it is like to be a bat because we do not possess the possibility, we do not have the faculty of sonar echolocation. So we can never comprehend what it is like to be a bat from inside. And it is pertinently this phenomena of experience or this phenomenal consciousness phenomenal consciousness or the experiential consciousness that concerns the heart problem. The heart problem is simply put, can physical or functional explanations account for phenomenal consciousness? Then if you go on trying to build explanatory project about consciousness, you need three questions that need to be answered. The first is the what question, that is the descriptive question. The second is the how or the explanatory question, and the why question, that is why does consciousness exist? Does it have any function? That is a functional question. So any explanation of consciousness must adhere to these three questions, must resolve or must put answers to these questions. Now, there are seven features of consciousness. That is particularly the what aspect of consciousness, the descriptive feature of consciousness. If you are trying to answer what is consciousness, you need to take into account these seven features of consciousness. The first is the qualitative factor, the raw feels or the qualia that you feel. Qualia is the first person subjective experience. For example, the first person subjective experience of seeing an apple, of eating an apple, seeing the red color of an apple or the green color of an apple. That is the qualitative factor. Then it has a phenomenal structure. When you eat a burger, for example, you feel something from the inside. That is the phenomenal structure. Then comes subjectivity. Subjectivity is the first person orientation of knowledge. Then it is always self perspectival organization. Consciousness exhibits a self perspectival organization in the sense that every experience that you feel occurs to you from a subject point of view. Then consciousness is a unitary phenomena. It has the integrity of content, it has the integration of agency in it. All our conscious thoughts or all conscious states are about something. They exhibit an aboutness. They have a direct awareness of the world. And then there is a semantic transparency in which the meaning, the signifier and the signified, the meaning and the word both are simultaneously human. Finally, you have the dynamic flow of consciousness, that is the autopoietic stream of consciousness. your mind constantly generates a linear flow of consciousness, or a non-linear flow of consciousness, but that there is a flow of consciousness, or the stream of consciousness that it keeps on generating. How that generates is another question we will be discussing that during the course of the lecture. Now, the explanatory question concerns the hard problem, pertinently the question that how can consciousness exist from, particularly the question that how can consciousness exist, or how can consciousness appear from supposedly neural substrate, or from supposedly computational substrate, or from supposedly physical substrate. Scientists, for example, John Levine and McGinn, believe that there is an explanatory gap the in the explanation of consciousness merely from physical or neural or computational domain, or from computational substrates. Then, does it have a function? Does consciousness have a function? And if so, what is it? So, does consciousness have a function? This is the graph plot upon x and y axis. One view about the functional nature of consciousness can be epiphenomenalism, which says that consciousness is an epiphenomena. It's a phenomena that is happening beside the main phenomena. For example, when you see the waves on a shore, when the waves crash on a shore, they you see bubbles, you see froth, but that froth or those bubbles, they play no role in the wave itself, in the formation of the wave itself, or how the wave comes about on the beach. Then you may believe that consciousness plays a constitutive role, that to explain consciousness you need to explain certain aspects of consciousness. Then there may be functional irrelevance. Functional irrelevance mean that there can be some other mechanism to explain what consciousness does. There can be some other explanation. Nature could have devised or come up with some other way for the function that consciousness performs. So you can plot a graph of it, of the different positions of the function of consciousness, the functional role it plays, the causal role it plays, and the functional specificity in these four quadrants. So before identifying with its function, we must impact if consciousness has a causal impact. So the first track says that it consciousness aids in physical behavior, or consciousness is an epiphenomenon. So these are the two views that go about in the field of philosophy. Now these are the six proposed roles about the function of consciousness. It offers flexible control. Conscious processing handles novel situations with adaptable self-control, self-aware control at the cost of speed. Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, demarcated the distinction between two kinds of thinking system. One is system two, system one thinking, another is system two thinking. One thinking is slow thinking that requires conscious deliberation, and other is the automatic process, or the automatic process, or the reflexive process, in which the action is immediate. The action is immediate in the sense that there is no conscious deliberation. So consciousness helps in deliberation over a particular thing. It helps you deliberate upon a belief. It helps you form belief systems. In that sense, consciousness plays the role of flexible control. Then it helps in social coordination. We know that we have this theory in philosophy of mind, that we form a theory of mind. The theory of mind helps us to know about other person's state of mind, other person's feelings, emotion, etc. In science, in particularly neuroscience, this is explained with the concept of mirror neurons. So what empathy, or what these theory of mind, or what these mirror neurons does, is that it helps you to coordinate with other people. It helps you to understand other people, and that in turn enhances the cooperation. Then consciousness gives you an integrated representation. Conscious experiences, it unifies the multimodal information. You have information coming through your eyes, you have information coming through your ears, nose, etc. It is all coalesced into one coherent, integrated representation, and that is the function of consciousness. It forms a coherent experience that is situated within space and time. Then you have the global information access. Consciousness allows for global information access, and we will discuss this when we'll be discussing Bernard Bass' theory of consciousness. Then freedom of will. To be free, or to exhibit free will, is also to have the knowledge of the options that exist apart from the most obvious one. You to be free is to exhibit, is to know the options that are present before you apart from the most obvious one. So to be free, you need to have the knowledge of all the options that are available. And finally, it plays the role of intrinsic motivations. The When you exhibit a conscious state, it affects your whole body. Your consciousness is not disembodied. We will discuss this further in the lecture. Your consciousness is not simply a disembodied phenomenon; it is an embodied phenomenon. When you feel a conscious mental state, for example, when you feel happy, that whole experience of pleasure or experience of happiness, it acts as a motivator. It activates your dopamine. It produces serotonin, etc. All these neurochemicals that play their role in the informing or shaping of the experience. These intrinsic motivations, consciousness gives you an intrinsic motivation. These mental states, they form an intrinsic motivation to seek dopamine or to seek new things or novelty, and hence it is evolutionary, ancient, as well as powerful. Now, these are the different functions of consciousness associated with their evolutionary adaptive value and with their associative state type. For example, you can associate the social coordination with meta-mental or narrative consciousness. You can correlate the integrated representation with phenomenal or excess consciousness, etc. Now, any student who tries to study consciousness or mind or these things, the first topic that is introduced in almost every university, every college, every place is when you study philosophy of mind, it is the mind body problem. So, this problem has not yet been solved, though there are many solutions, but there is no agreed upon universal solution. So, we shall enter the problem of consciousness with the mind body problem. What is the difference between mind and consciousness? A layman difference would be that mind encompasses the entirety of our cognitive and functional operations, many of which occur unconsciously. Consciousness, on the other hand, is a specific subset of mental life focused on subjective awareness, phenomenal experience, which we call qualia, and particularly what it is like to be in a particular state to perceive the world. A functional definition that is currently agreed upon, given by Stephen Pinker, is that mind is what the brain does, and one of the things it does is produce consciousness. So, in this sense, consciousness is subservient to mind. Now, what are the aspects of mind? Mind is non-physical, it is non-spatial. You cannot pinpoint your mind. If I ask, where is your idea of Eiffel Tower of Paris? You can show me the neurons firing, you can show me the Eiffel Tower in France, in Paris, but you cannot show the idea. You can show me some neuronal signals on an EEG or on some fMRI, but you cannot show exactly where that idea is. Where is the idea of the Eiffel Tower of Paris. So, in this sense, mind is non-physical, it is non-spatial, it is a thinking substance. It possesses intentionality. It possesses intentionality means that it is always about something. Mind has phenomenal properties. Phenomenal properties means the whole subjective experience, the whole plethora of experience, the integration of information, all that it feels like to be in a particular mental state has an accompanied feeling. It has a phenomenal property, and then mind is immediately known. Mind is immediately known in the sense that, for example, when you infer something, you know it through a mediating epistemic instrument. For example, when you infer that since there is smoke on the hill, there must be fire on the hill as well. So that knowledge is not immediate, it is mediate, because it is mediated by the knowledge of smoke. Your knowledge of fire is mediated by the knowledge of smoke. But this does not apply to the mind, and mind is immediately known. Now, coming to the question, what is the mind body problem? I would like to put it, or as one of a great philosopher of mind, Jonathan Westphal, puts it. He puts it in the form of an inconsistent tetrad, where the mind is a non-physical entity, body is a physical entity. They both interact, and physical and non-physical things cannot interact. All these four propositions cannot be simultaneously true together. One of the propositions has to go. If the mind and body interact, then mind and body need to be same thing. Either they need to be mental or they need to be physical. So one of the premises or one of the propositions has to go from this inconsistent tetrad. All these four propositions cannot be simultaneously true together, and this is pertinently the mind-body problem. Now, mind-body problem, during the course of my thesis, of my PhD thesis, I classified the mind-body problem into three questions. They are the ontological question, the causal question, and the question of consciousness. Now, what is the ontological question? That what are these mental states? Are they physical states, like are they brain states, as the identity theory proposes, or they are computational states, or as the computational theory proposes? What are these states, mental states? then we know that mind and body interact in the sense that you have a desire to drink water, your hand automatically goes to a glass of water and you take that water, have a sip and put it down, and that quenches down your thirst. In this sense, mind and body interact. But what is their mechanism? Mind is the non-physical thing, body is a physical thing. How do they interact? Finally, you have the question of consciousness. The question of consciousness is pertinently the heart problem. How does the physical substrate or the neural substrate or the computational substrate produce the first person feeling of consciousness that is known as the P consciousness or the phenomenal consciousness? And this is where the easy problem and the hard problem of David Chalmers intervene. This is the particular place. Now, Western attempts at explaining these three questions have been through basically through these three theories. First, the substance dualism. The concept is that mind and body are completely distinct and they are capable of existing without one another. Parallelism says that mind and body never interact, they are like synchronized. For example, you have one stream of consciousness or mind mentality going, then you have another state of physicality going. They somehow are very fine tuned by God. There is a pre-established harmony in the sense that when you have a physical state of thirst, when you feel that your throat is going when your throat is dry, your mind automatically, when you feel that state, your body automatically goes out into the world and reaches out to a glass of water and you drink it. Then we have the property dualism or emergentism is a different thing, but here we are trying to put it into one. Property dualism says that there are no two substances, there are two properties. There is one single substance and they exhibit two properties. The first property is a mental property and the other property is physical property. So these are the three theories of dualism, the three broad theories of dualism, which are given from the Western side. Then you have trying to reduce the mind to some physical thing. For example, behaviorism reduces the mind to observable behavior. Identity theory says that pain is C fiber stimulation. They try to reduce mental states to brain states. Functionalism says that mind is a software running on brain's hardware. So they try to reduce the mental state to a computational state. Then you have eliminatism by Paul and Patricia Churchland, and they say that eliminatism basically posits that mind does not exist. These we feel or we say that the mind exists because we believe in some kind of mental concepts which they both call folk psychology. For example, hope, belief, pain, they will be replaced by better theories, by better scientific theories, by better neuroscientific theories, and finally, the whole dichotomy of mind and matter would cease. Every mental aspect would be explained by a better theory other than folk psychology. Then you have the other side of the coin, and that is a radical reversal to the universal mind. There are three kinds of theories that argue that mind is the basic entity or that reality somehow constitutes a mental entity. First theory in this line of thought is the solipsism theory. It says that only my mind is my mind is the only thing which exists. Why they say so? Because it is the only thing that you can know with certainty. You can know only your mind with certainty. You may empathize with some others' feelings, emotions, problems, etc., but you cannot experientially know their mind. Then you have the panpsychism or the theory which basically says that all that exists is consciousness, is somehow mind, because consciousness cannot emerge from dead matter. From nothing comes nothing. You need something, you need consciousness prior hand to exhibit consciousness later hand. Then you have the theory of idealism proposed by Berkeley, who says that physical bodies are nothing more than phenomenal assertions of sensory stimuli. Now, there are some responses to physicalism, particularly in the form of these five objections, five thought experiments, which we can discuss if you all later want. You can note down the name of these thought experiments, and we can discuss these later on. The first thought experiment is the inverted spectrum. Then you have the zombie thought experiment. You have color Mary thought experiment. You have the Nagel's bat. You have the Chinese room argument given by John Searle. Now, let's try to brew some or let's discuss some theories of consciousness. Let's brew some theories of consciousness. I will be discussing four theories of consciousness. The first amongst them is the global workspace theory. The global workspace theory provides a unified framework of understanding how the brain integrates and broadcasts information to produce conscious experience. The central puzzle is this, that you have a very narrow conscious capacity. Though you have 100 billion neurons, you have 10 to the power 15 or something neurons and 10 to the power 18 to 20 connections between them, between those neurons. But in this sense, you have a vast unconscious capacity. When you look at the complexity of the brain and you look at the narrow nature of your conscious experience, you can be conscious about a particular thing. You have to focus your attention to something to be conscious about. That is very limited. So the question is, why is consciousness so limited while the conscious is so vast? What does this trade-off mean? This is the basic question for this theory. And remind you, this is one of the first theories from psychology, from cognitive sciences that came to explain the nature and the function and the description of consciousness. Now, any psychology student might remember this, that working memory holds a very narrow place. It can hold up to 7 plus minus 2 items at once, and it drops to around 4 items without rehearsal. Then you have just one dense stream of information flowing. When you compare it with the brain, you have 100 billion neurons. Why the difference? Why the dichotomy that you have so large unconscious capacity, so large so large physical architecture, and yet so narrow conscious capacity? So they say, Bernard Barr says that consciousness acts as a gateway. It helps. Consciousness is mediated by the neural control, by the mental lexicon, by the autobiographical memory, and the automatic routines. He gives out this theater metaphor in which he says that there is a stage. The stage is the working memory where conscious events appear. Then he gives the idea of the spotlight. Spotlight is the selective attention which gives consciousness their narrowness. Attention is when you focus on one or two things. If you're focusing on too many things, that is not attention. To be attentive is to focus on a limited set of data. So you have the spotlight, that is the selective attention. Then you have a fringe. There are some things, for example, when you have peripheral vision, you're not immediately aware about your peripheral vision, but you are aware that there is something. When you put your consciousness spotlight, uh, put your selective attention to the fringe or to the peripheral vision, then you get aware of them. So that constitutes the fringe, and behind the scenes is the unconscious context operators. So stage is the working memory, attention is the spotlight, actors are the conscious contents, then director is the self, audience is the unconscious specialized network, and backstage is the unconscious context. Now, how does this theater work? There are various competing inputs, then you have the spotlight selection, then there is a global contrast, and then you have the local interpretation of the unconscious to the conscious. So this is a functional representation of the workspace model from Bernard books in the theater of consciousness. As you can see, there is a fringe, there is the conscious experience, the center white light in the center written conscious experience. The spotlight of attention is shining on the stage of working memory. Okay, so this is the model of Bernard Bass. Now, there are some criticisms to it. Fortunately, the qualia problem, information. How does information become subjective experience? We are conscious of qualia. We are not conscious of the inner computation. We are not conscious about the encoded data. We are conscious about the subjective experience. What Bernard Bass does is he explains the encoded information, but that encoded information is not the same as subjective experience. So the problem of qualia still stands. The second problem is the integration gap. How do these various competing inputs from different sources and get unified, and how does this come together to form an integrated consciousness? And the final critique is from the functionalists who say that the theory assigns a consciousness a functional role, selecting and integrating information. Now, how does that give rise to qualia? Okay, so these are the three critiques pointed to the global workspace theory model. One other theory which you have coming from the neuroscientific side is the neural correlate consciousness or neural correlate of consciousness theory. It starts with the basic premise that science runs on correlation. So, for example, you might have very well heard that smoking causes cancer. Wrong. Smoking does not cause cancer. Smoking is correlated with cancer. What causes cancer is the chemicals, the arsenic, the bromide, and the various plethora of chemicals that are involved in the smoke that comes out when you smoke a cigarette. Those are the real response. Those are the real chemicals that cause you cancer. The integrate the when these chemicals react with your bodily mechanism, when they react with your lung, that is what is causing cancer, not the act of smoking itself. So the direct causation is based on those chemicals. The correlation is with consciousness. And correlation is not causation. Okay. So, but that is how the science progresses. Science works on correlations. But this posits the fallacy of come hoc ergo propter hoc, or after this, therefore, because of this. So that's how science works. Now, what is NCC? What NCC, or the neural correlate of consciousness, refers to the minimal neuronal activity required for a conscious experience to arise. Now, this is a materialistic assumption where obviously now it places some necessary condition that certain neuronal processes are required for consciousness, and there is no consensus on what constitutes an NCC or neural correlate of consciousness. It is the feedback loop, oscillation, neurotransmitters, connectome. What Francis Crick and Christoph Koch say that is that it is a 40 hertz theory, which we'll be discussing in a minute or two. This theory was proposed by Francis Crick, the discoverer of DNA, and Christoph Koch, who is now working with Giulio Tononi, the theorist who gave the integrated information theory, which we'll be discussing further in the lecture. This theory came from the binding problem that we see that your vision involves different centers of the brain. Your unified visual experience involves different centers of the brain. It involves lateral occipital cortex, V1, V2, V4. They process colors, etc. How does the question that motivated Christoph Koch and Francis Crick was that how does your unified visual experience comes about? They came up with 40 hertz hypothesis, and they say that deep within your brain there are oscillations, neural oscillations going at around 35 to 70 range, with average of them would be 45, and they integrate the various elements of conscious experience into one. The synchronized firing, the cells fire in unison, membrane voltages change together, attention is required, global activity, all these things come together at 40 hertz to produce the conscious experience of, say, vision. Here also you have the problem of qualia, you have the gap. How does NCC theory, the neural correlate of consciousness theory, it describes mechanism, but it does not explain the phenomenological experience of consciousness itself. Again, you have the qualia thing. You are reducing something to brain process, but you have no theory that how does qualia, or the first person subjective experience, arise from that 40 hertz neuronal firing in your brain. Again, you have the heart problem, and you have you had the heart problem of consciousness, that how does your experience come about, which is something non-physical. How does it come from the neural or computational or the other substrates in the brain? How does the non-physical thing arrive from something which is physical? Next, you have the integrated information theory. Giulio Tononi, the propounder of this theory, asks us a basic question: that can we measure consciousness? Can we mathematically define consciousness in such way that that we can measure it? Giulio Tononi starts with our first-person phenomenology, and he gives 6 axioms of conscious experience, and he contrasts them, or he links them with his theory, or with the postulates of his theory. The axioms of conscious experience are given on the screen. The first is the existence. My experience here and exists now. It is real. Conscious experience is very real. It has a composition. Every experience combines different elements into a unison. Then it has information into it. You feel like your experience feel like something from the inside. Then there is integration. It is all into a unified single experience. And at one moment you have one single experience. In Tononi's theory, information is meaning. Your brain cuts down the probability, cuts down the manifoldness into oneness. The manifoldness of a particular word exhibiting different meanings is curtailed down, and just one meaning is produced forward. In that sense, information is pairing. information is meaning, and then he gives a measure of the consciousness, which is phi. Phi is a mathematical measure of the integrated information in a particular system. You can understand this theory with the example of a camera analogy. When you look at an image, or a camera that has light detector photodiode, when you look at a single diode, it exhibits only light or dark. Then you have a camera with pixels. Now, if you just look at one single photodiode, or if you look just at one pixel, it is either dark or it is lit up. That single data point, or that single photodiode, or that single pixel is not enough to give you consciousness. But when they are integrated together, they give rise to the photo, they give rise to the megapixel, different 121, 123, or whatever the number may be, megapixel image to you. So that integration of the different information in the different pixels is what constitutes your physical experience or of consciousness. What This IIT theory, integrated information theory, has some interesting implications for AI. Uh, Giulio Tononi says that AI can be conscious, because if integrated information is consciousness, then if AI gets sufficient integrated information, it would also be conscious. Again, it is not testable. These are some criticisms and limitation. It is not testable. Information is not qualia. Then emotional layer is missing, and then you have the epistemological gaps. The final theory, that other theory that we will the theory of other persons that we will be discussing in this lecture, is the disembodied mind in Damasio says that differentiates between the disembodied mind and the embodied mind. Disembodied mind is basically that brain works as an information processor and it is isolated from the body, whereas the embodied mind hypothesis says that the mind requires a physical body. It requires a certain sort of embodiment. In his book, Descartes said that he replies to this, to the disembodied mind argument, and he says that Descartes committed this error, that he separated the body, the world, and the mind. This uh, dichotomy, or this sort of segregation won't work. To have a conscious experience as a whole, you need three components. You need the body, you need the brain, and you need the environment where the intention of the mind will act through the body. Now he differentiates between mind and consciousness. Mind, he says, is a stream of mental images. Consciousness, on the other hand, is the feeling of being aware. What constitutes a conscious mind? Wakefulness, a functional mind, and the sense of self. Consciousness without feelings is impossible. Now, finally, coming to our part, or my theory, that is some sharing with you some Indian perspectives on consciousness. So, Indian system of philosophy involves two different systems of thought. The first system of thought is the orthodox school, which believes in the authority of the Vedas, and the second is the unorthodox school, or the heterodox school, which is the Buddhism, Jainism, and Charvak. We, for our concern, will be focusing on Charvak, Nyaya Vaisheshik, Sankhya, and Advait Vedanta, more specifically on the Advait Vedanta, because my theory constitutes element from the Advait Vedanta theory. Charvak, they are materialists, and they are somehow emergentists. They say that consciousness is emerges from the basic physical phenomena. Nyaya they say that they are realist about consciousness, and they say that consciousness is a quality produced by the interaction of soul, mind, and senses. It is not the essence. Consciousness is not the essence. Dualists like Sankhya and Yoga, they say that there is a dichotomy of consciousness and matter, and they do not interact, only proximity is there. Advait Vedant, on the other hand, synthesizes all these views and say that consciousness is the only reality, and mind is a functional appearance reflecting consciousness. The whole quest of Indian philosophy, the whole quest of Indian consciousness studies starts with the question, who am I? Who hum? मैं कौन हूँ? Now, to understand this more question somewhat more deeply, I will like to quote a shlok from the Upanishad. It says that Paranchikhani Vyatirna Swayam Bhush Tasmat Pran Pashyanti Nanatram Kashit Dhira Pratyagatman Akshad Ave Chakshur Amritam Ichan. This shloka says that your senses are extroverted, and that is why many people conflate themselves or identify themselves with the pleasure given by the senses. and fail to recognize the self that lies within the body, that lies within him. And when the body, or when the attention, or when the inner eyes turns in, you recognize yourself and you become immortal. Now, this is the chariot, the famous chariot metaphor given in the Katha Upanishad and given in the Bhagavad Gita as well, where you have a chariot and you have horses, you have the reins, you have the Sarthi, and you have the Rathi. So the body is the chariot. Okay? The intellect or the buddhi is the controller. Who is taking the chariot? Who is riding the chariot? Who is riding the horses? Who is taking the horses? Who is controlling the horses? The manas is the connector. The manas is the senses that connect the buddhi to the horses. The horses. The rathi, or the person or the master of the whole thing, is the atman, or the silent witness. And then you have the senses. Senses are the horses. They keep running. The senses are the horses, and then finally they run on the path of pleasure, and displeasure, etc. Okay, so this is again the same thing. Now, what I will try to present is an integrated model of experience, and in this integrated model, you have three components pertinently: the body, that is the gross matter, that is the spatial and temporal. Then you have the mind, it is the cognitive instrument, which we will be calling as antakaran. It is subtle matter. It is not exactly the same as gross matter. It is subtle matter. We don't know what in what sense mind can be subtle. Perhaps what my theory proposes is that perhaps it is information. Then you have the consciousness, or the sakshi, which is the witness, which illumines the vrittis, or the fluctuations, or the happenings of the mind. Again, there's a difference that I would like to put here. Consciousness is not the same as the mind. The mind body complex is the vehicle through which qualia, or the first person subjective experience, is expressed. Consciousness is not the same as mind. Then you have mind, consciousness, and brain. Brain is distinct from mind. Mind is non-local. Then you have mind, which is subtle matter and obeys physical principles. And then you have consciousness, which is not generated by the mind, merely reflected by it. Okay. Then what constitutes the mind, or what constitutes the antakaran, the terminology that we will be using for the concept mind? It is chit. It is the storehouse, memory storehouse. You have the buddhi. It is the intellect. It does the job of forming deliberative consciousness, or the nishchayatmak vritti. Then you have the manas. The first thing is the manas. Manas is the processing unit. It is responsible for attention, filtering, and analysis. Then you have the ahankar, which produces the distinct sense of I. In this, what is important to note here is that manas is not mind. Manas is just one component of the antakaran, which we will be calling as mind. Now, mind works as an interface. Antakaran or mind works as an interface. It makes the body its instrument, and it reflects, or it gets illumined by the light of the Sakshi consciousness. It has a downward link where it links to the brain and bodily function. Then it has an upward link where it receives the illuminating light of consciousness. The senses, or the whole process of perception or cognition, starts with the senses. You have your eyes, ears, nose, mouth. All these to gather stimuli from the environment. All these are turned into brain signals by Fourier transform. At below 10 milliseconds, there is no differentiation between the various sensory modalities. That differentiation, that it is an information retrieved from the eye or from ear, that differentiation happens at 30 milliseconds. Manas does this. Manas analyzes the sensory data. It acts as a sixth sense, in the sense that it receives input from interior states as well. It is what prompts and initiates the cognitive process. It serves as the internal sense organ. It is how the reality gets into a system. It's how the whole processing starts. Then you have the buddhi. Once the manas part of our antakaran or mind has gathered the raw data from the senses, it is moved forward to the buddhi, or the intellect, that is the decisive faculty that categorizes sensory input and compares it to past experience and forms judgment. It asks, what is this and what does this mean for me? This is where perception is shaped into a coherent thought. Then it moves to I maker, of forging a self concept. Once an experience is interpreted, it needs an owner. The ahankar is the faculty that creates the sense of I. It takes the judgment from the buddhi and integrates into a personal narrative, making decisions based on thought. This is happening to me. Now, this particular feeling is due to the I or the ahankar. Then you have the karmendriyas, which are the executor. They translate your thought into action. Now, everyone knows that these are the three components that go into the formation of the conscious experience that you feel. Words acts as input, thought they transform into thoughts which you experience as a flow of information, and then you have the self which acts as the context. In the self, the signifier, the signified, creator, and the created are all intertwined into one single unity. Then you have the ego, that is the most visible manifestation of the conditioned mind, and it is what separates you from the ultimate consciousness. It bridges the external subjective perspective while eluding the true nature of consciousness. The ego obscures the path to true consciousness, and it also acts as a bridge, as a mediator between the external world and the ultimate consciousness. Now, direction of perception, the conventional view says that the stimulus travels to the person, whereas the Advait view or my view or the theory that I am positing here says that mind is directed itself towards the object. Mind also acts as repository. It consists of all the mind is the source of cognition's contents and the storehouse of past acts and their consequences. Consciousness in mind is always laced with emotions dependent on prior memories and desires. Sanskar and vasana, past actions, they feed your impressions, they form sanskaras, they feed your vasana desires, which shapes cognition, which creates new actions, and that in turns becomes a past action, and that again feeds your sanskar, vasana, etc. It is a continuous loop. Then mind is always in a state of perpetual flux. There's always emotional curving, and it always has a mistaken identity. Now, the role of Sakshi is to illumine these mental states, these the fluctuations of the mind-body consciousness, mind-body complex, the vrittis of the mind-body of the mind-body complex. This is the model. This is a framework or a description of the consciousness that I have made. As you can recall the previous slides, the whole thing starts with the Jnanendriya, the whole five senses of knowledge. They carry the information that goes to the Manas. Manas does the Sankalp and Vikalp Vritti. It selects the pros and cons. Then it presents it to the Buddhi. Buddhi takes a decision on it. Then that moves to the Chit, that is the memory or the storehouse of impressions, Vasana, etc. Then that goes to ahankar, and then again that is executed through the karmendriyas. When an action is executed, you again get a feedback from the environment, and that runs again your jnanendriyas, and again manas, and the whole loops continues. Now, this is my contribution, Advait feedback loop. I have pointed out three routes that this whole feedback loop mechanism can follow. One is the route A, that is the unconscious habit. It follows the manas chit buddhi route. Then route B is conscious choice. It travels to the Manas Buddhi Chitta route. Then you have the passive storage that goes Manas to Chit. Okay. And this is a mechanism. It is the closed feedback loop mechanism, which we will be discussing further. So this is again a full-fledged diagram, an illuminated this deconstruction of the cognitive apparatus. You have the senses, the raw data, mind, categorization moves into buddhi, that into ego. Ego then forms actions. Action is executed through karmendriyas. Then you have action outcome that gives a feedback loop that influences perception again to the senses. Now this time, when this whole thing is traveling linearly, it will form a belief system which influences your buddhi, which influences your intellect, and this guides your identity formation, which affects your ahankar. This is again the same thing. So the Advait feedback loop that I am proposing involves the neuroscientific aspect of it as well. The brain processing is governed by the thalamocortical loop. It presents an integrated whole, a representation of the object of the world. It is a represented whole that shapes your will or intent, which is a component of the mind and takaran, and that action is again relayed by the parietal relay or the parietal cortex. Then you have unseen architects of your conscious experience. They are beliefs and memory. Belief system is not just the foundational code, it is a database. It filters, it actively influences how your manas filters reality and how the buddhi interprets it. Beliefs are shaped by cognition, language, and social factors. Then we have the chit, the memory, which is or the subconscious, which is the storehouse of past impressions and experiences, sanskaras. It provides the context and emotional coloring for every new piece of data the buddhi analyzes. Now, our theory addresses the neurosciences localization problem. The localization problem particularly says, for example, Descartes used to say that the seat of the mind is the pineal gland. Then there was this theory that there are specific regions. Then there are theories like the IIT, which says that neurons tie together. It is the whole integrated network that forms your that forms your mind. Or we can say we have another model like Barthes, which who says that consciousness is globally local and locally global. Uh, Evidence for there is empirical evidence for embodied mind, and that comes pertinently from gut brain research axis. They say that your gut acts as a second brain, and it shapes many mental diseases, for example Alzheimer's. So there is ample amount of empirical evidence that is coming and saying that consciousness or your mental faculty is pervaded throughout the body. You are an embodied being, not a disembodied being. Then we have two levels of consciousness, the empirical level, which is tied to body and thinking. It is worldly, it is the perceiving consciousness. And then in philosophy, you have the transcendental consciousness, which is beyond the limited energy. It is non dual, it is pure awareness beyond space and time. The empirical consciousness, which is an outcome of the reflection of consciousness on the mind, on the internal instrument, on the antakaran, uh, by the transcendental consciousness or the Brahman consciousness or the one non-dual consciousness. It is the reflection. Empirical consciousness is the reflection of the transcendental consciousness. Continuity of experience is explicable only through non-duality. Consciousness exists beyond space and time. The phenomenal experience is a created. It is created by the interaction of Sakshi consciousness and the mind or the Antakaran. In that sense, they are within space and time, but your transcendental consciousness is beyond space and time. Now, again, this is the same thing, the input, the filtering, the reference. You receive, senses receive the physical data, it is filtered. Then there is reference, the memory consults, the mind consults the memory bank, the chip. We do not see the world as it is. We see it through the filter of our past impressions. Then you have the decision, appropriation, execution, and there is a time gap. Libet's experiments show that neural preparation 200 milliseconds before conscious will. The ego is a retroactive conscious, is a narrator claiming ownership of an automated process. The karmic mechanism, every action has a फल. आप कोई भी काम करते हैं उसका फल होता है और वो फल आपके मेमोरी में जाता है. That feeds back into your memory. And when when the whole body and the whole brain is acting into it, you have the famous Hebbian model of learning, which says that neurons that fire together wire together. And this creates a trap wherein the repeated actions deepen specific neural pathways, habits, vasanas, and these deep grooves bias future perception, creating a self-reinforcing belief system. Now, this is a glitch in the system how biases create loops. The feedback loop is designed to learn, but it can also get trapped. The cognitive biases create self reinforcing circles where the system only confirms what is already given. In Advaita, these glitches have specific names. They are Maya and Avidya, Vritti, or the latent impression, as we call them, sanskars. Now, this creates a cognitive bias loop. The ahankar, shaped by past sanskaras, uses the buddhi not to find truth but to confirm its own existence. It seeks evidence that reinforces the belief. This is what is known as confirmation bias and ignores data that challenges them, motivated reasoning. Now, this forms a belief trap where a rigid identity is formed that is resistant to new information. Now, we can use the process of critical thinking and self inquiry or the process of self reflection to break this loop, to break the loop. Okay. Then your brain acts as an information system. This brain collects data, it encodes data, it stores data. Every time you have a cognition, it or a conscious experience, it also alters 0.1% of your genetic code, regulating the body processes through the same synergistic loop. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, we can apply our model to explain certain phenomena like why does the mind wander. So mind wandering is a problem is fundamentally a memory problem. The mind constantly seeks the certainty of past pleasure experiences to engage survival. And the result is when you try to focus, the chitta repeatedly puts the manas forward through familiar sensory objects, compounding desires until the mind reaches complete disorder and fatigue. Your will at one event, say W1, is engaged or has an additional component, that is the memory of past feedback, of past pleasure, and that gets involved with your feedback loop, and that forms your next will, and that is the compounded will W2. Now this can be explained with this diagram. Every um, There are quantum processes, and when there is a collapse of the wave function, it collapses at the subcellular level, give rise to W1. It is always engulfed in the space-time envelope. When it when it manifests in the classical world, there's a desired dimension that is attached to a W1, will one. That desired dimension generates an action, and that action is then compared with the actual dimension that creates a feedback loop, and that feedback loop gives you the W2 or the will 2 and the will 3. So will 1 is always free or need bound. W2 or the will 2 is W1 plus a space-time envelope plus feedback. W3 is again W1, W2, and this happens all till your brain or the whole system reaches entropy. This is again from my mentor's book, Dr. Alok Bajpayee. He integrates the quantum processes and dimensions into the whole process of cognition and conscious experience. We are trying to we are combinedly working on our theory, and we are trying to integrate the quantum processor into the brain. However, if you what he says is that it happens at the quantum tunneling happens at the subcellular and the synaptic level, then the decoherence happens into electrochemical signals, then you have the nonlinear neuronal connections which give rise to 500 millisecond frame of reality, which you experience as a conscious experience. Now, what is the whole thing about 500 millisecond frame of reality? As we talked before 10 millisecond, nothing from the sense modalities is differentiated. After 10 seconds, the unconscious differentiation begins. 200 milliseconds is the time frame that is the threshold for conscious experience. 500 milliseconds is the frame when the final reality emerges. Okay, 10 0 to 10 millisecond, there is no modality differentiation. Then 10 to 30 millisecond, modality differentiation begins. 200 millisecond, conscious threshold is reached. 200 to 500 milliseconds, unconscious processing to conscious frame. And then finally, at 500 milliseconds, you have full frame of reality that emerges. What emerges as reality is what the unconscious has already processed. Data is differentiated and integrated, possibly through quantum to classical decoherence, to create a frame of reality that adheres to external world for survival. The mind must remain aware of unconscious pressure on reality and be able to create a feedback to change the next 500 millisecond frame every second. This comes from the whole Libet's experiment, which guys from neuroscience might well know very well. So, how do we place free will? How do we explain free will in our Indian model? We know that the brain fires 500 milliseconds before we are aware of muscle activity, but free will exists not in initiating action, but in the power to veto it in the final milliseconds. Okay? 0 milliseconds is when the unconscious brain initiates action through readiness potential. 350 milliseconds, that is where awareness begins. 400 to 500 milliseconds is the time that 150 milliseconds of time is the window of conscious veto, where you can actively say no to a particular conscious awareness, to a particular frame of reality that is coming from the unconscious processing in the brain. The Indian model fully embraces this delay and says that the 500 millisecond gap in this exact space is where chit and ahankar interact, giving us the window to unconsciously alter the contents of our awareness. How does one frame influence the next? That whole W1, W2, W3 will compounded will thing. Okay, you can also break this whole loop of action wherein your conscious experience is shaped by unconscious elements during a 200 milliseconds window of freedom. Now the problem is that if memory drives mind, are we biological robots? The solution is that free will is actually free want. You have a 200 millisecond window to veto and free want. You have a 200 millisecond window to veto an impulse. Now, this happens when you're not engaging with the fluctuation, when the consciousness is not engaging itself with the fluctuations or the vrittis of the mind. Developing the vritti or witness or the sakshi allows us to observe the loop without engaging, preventing the formation of new binding impression. When does a new impression form? When you engage with your conscious experience. What you do in meditation or what you do in sleep is you disengage from your conscious experience. You just watch the contents of your experience, and that differentiates between the knower and the object of knowing, and that is where you break the loop. Now, how do you break this in a larger system, in a larger context, in the context of the whole cognitive instrument? You use your critical thinking ability, which we earlier called gyan, to break the bias loop, to break the loop of sanskar, to form a new self concept, to form a new interpretation, which helps you in belief expansion. Again, this is the same thing. Will Trishna and Maya. Trishna is the craving that is the cause of entanglement that you keeps you engaged within different will, within the chained wills, that is W1, W2, sum of parts, etc. Each will W1 generates a gap between desired and actual dimension. That gap births W2, tethered to W1. W1 plus W2 produces W3. It is greater than their sum. What Dr. Alok says is that every ostensible will is constrained by necessity. This is the material root of Maya and why Buddha say identified Krishna, craving as the cause of entanglement. The gap feeds frustration back to higher cortical centers where emotional lacing occurs. Mental training targets precisely that 50 millisecond window. Okay, you have a desired phase, you have perform an action, that gap is detected, that is conveyed to the central executive network and the salience network, and there is a reattempt to attain the desired phase. Okay, now, what happens during to mental health patient? A mental health patient magnifies the gap between desired and attained phase space, and higher centers perceive it as threat. Amygdala fires, central executive network loses control. Strange attractors pull the vector in a new direction. The result is that the feedback from the environment amplifies feeling, establishing a new level of subjective reality. Morality, empathy, and destructive concepts are all intertwined with this subjective feeling. In a distorted voice, you have during in mental health issues, you have a fragmented self. It is a result of smeared inner voice, the distorted story of self. Projected selves collide in the world, creating multiple layers of need, feedback loops, extinguish pathological firing over brain time. Nothing in the firing patterns is inherently pathological. Context ascertains it. This is what you do in any form of meditation. For example, the japa yoga meditation, or you try to rewire the whole loop. What you try to do is that you consciously follow the route B, conscious insertion. The practitioner deliberately chooses a mantra, and when the mind tries to wander, he calls the mantra from the chit and instead of the past pleasure, and that acts as an ultimate conscious veto uh, to stop to stop the whole loop that is going on, to break the loop. So this is the transition from automated loop to architect. To conscious architect. You need to observe, you need to inquire, and then finally need to create a choice. There are three levels of reality according to my theory. The first level is observational reality. Second is the comprehensional reality, where the mind actively processes and acts on the acquired information. And finally, you have the transcognitive states, which are meditative states, which appear in the process of realization, etc. Then you have the three levels of three manifestations of consciousness, the of conscious reality. First is the paramarthic, the ultimate reality, the ultimate consciousness. When you know that, then vyavaharik, and then finally the illusory level or the pratibhasik level, where the subjective reality constitutes dreams, experiences, and is real only to the experiencer momentarily. Then you have the three states of the mind again. You have the waking, where there is a body identity. Then you have the dreaming, where there is mind identity. Then in deep sleep, there is no identity because identity involves two different entities. In sleep, there is no two. You don't have the dichotomy between mind because the mind is shut when sleep, and you have just the consciousness. And in The fourth state, the Turiya state, there is just the witness, there is just the consciousness. Now, again, this is an illustration of cognitive biases according to my theory. Okay. We can one of the testable in hypothesis of my mind that we had of my theory of our theory of mind that I and Alok Bajpai are working on is that the whole measurement of information can be done if we map out empirically the antacurrent feedback loop, because it is what provides the integration of information within our cognitive apparatus. Okay, so the whole view on consciousness can be put into two different view subset about consciousness. The first view is the Buddhist view, which says that reality is a transitory flux, that all that you know is the transition of your mind from one state to another. Whereas Advaita Vedanta says that there is an immutable entity, the Kutastha Chaitanya, which governs the empirical world from a transcendental standpoint. Okay, then the world is a creation of Maya probably means that this interface between mind and external world, the meaning of the mind, the world, the mind, meaning that the mind makes of the world is Maya. We live in it. So, in this sense, Maya is real. You can check out his views, his whole theory in his book, Mind is Reality and Brain Creates It. And in this sense, Maya is real. And this is our Maya's reality model. It is multidisciplinary. It advocates for feedback loops at every level. It argues that consciousness is both transcendent, it is immanent as well, and there is no right and wrong at the level of your conscious state. You cannot place uh, anything to be wrong or right until there is a conscious veto at the level of 400 to 500 millisecond flashing frame. Morality does not exist. What creates morality is the feedback loop you get from the environment. Okay. Again, there is a scientific limit to our there is a scientific limit to our theory. Science demands that objectivity they cannot meet themselves. This is the limit of the sciences. The philosophical need is to coalesce the whole scientific experiments into the whole philosophical thing with the scientific experiments, and you have to escape the naive optimism that is mind an illusion or a field spanning neurons to environment. The key takeaways are sensory integration, consciousness first, feedback loops, and a multidisciplinary model which you are proposing of an emergent consciousness, which is the phenomenal consciousness. It is shaped by our socio-cultural context, neural feedback loop, and perhaps quantum processes as well. Open question for neuroscience would be how to account for whole body consciousness within empirical frameworks. For philosophy, for particularly our theory, it would be can Advait non-localized consciousness be reconciled with mechanistic brain science? The common consensus is that there are open questions for both philosophers and neuroscientists like where they can collaborate and form a new theory or come up with some different perspectives on consciousness, etc. Thank you.